When I come out to my ship, I usually do about eight weeks. When I go back to my family, it's ordinarily around the four weeks at home. So it's not a bad rotation. We will have sacrifices in the maritime, being away from family and loved ones, but
How long have you been in this field?
I've been a mariner for 40 years. I've had a few birthdays. I think as technology has moved on, it's changed the whole landscape of how people undertake their learning or how they gain knowledge. And whereas in my day back,
The last time when I was doing my research and everything, at the moment, I think one of our product also, we were doing a hybrid system, solar and wind turbine. So we combine that together. So that's also one of the trend at the moment. Hi everyone, welcome to my episode 13 of the Innovators Minutes. Like every other episodes, we have inventor from different industry. And in today's episode, we have inventor from the maritime industry, Mr. Gordon from UK, who has 40 years of experience in maritime industry. This section is definitely going to be very insightful and it's very useful to those seafarers out there, and you're going to learn a lot of innovations, especially in education, in the oil and gas and maritime industry, in terms of renewables and environmental. So stay tuned and you wouldn't want to miss today's section. Hi, Mr. Gordon. How are you?
I'm fine, Visha. Thank you so much for inviting me here.
So which part of the world are you right now?
I'm in Taiwan, but I've left my ship because I'm a mariner, and I'm in a hotel waiting to go back home to my family in the United Kingdom. So looking forward to that.
Oh, it's exciting. That must be exciting. So that will be how long you'll be in UK after this? Like once you go back, how long you'll be there with your family?
When I come out to my ship, I usually do about eight weeks. When I go back to my family, it's ordinarily around the four weeks at home. So it's not a bad rotation. We will have sacrifices in the maritime, being away from family and loved ones, but yeah, we make up for it when I do get back home.
How long have you been in this field?
I've been a mariner for 40 years. I've had a few birthdays offshore.
Wow.
I was in the United Kingdom Royal Navy for the first part of my career in submarines. So that's a bit weird as a career move. But as a man of the sea, when I retired, I decided that, yeah, I would go back to sea, but instead of under the water, on top of the water. And now I serve in a whole variety of different ships, primarily involved with critical infrastructure projects. So that's usually the offshore industry, oil and gas, renewables and environmental projects.
Well, that's really a lot. 40 years, you must have like full passion into all this, right? Because without passion, you cannot be going into this, cannot be in this field for the longest time. Am I right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, like I said, there are sacrifices, but I think with myself, like yourself, with an engineering background, if you want to really challenge yourself, then yeah, you have to step up to the plate, accept that there will be some sacrifices, but to work in some of the fields that I've had the honor of doing, it puts your engineering skills very much to the test.
True.
And of course, it's global, so it's all around the world and all different projects. It sounds very exciting. Sometimes it's not, but there you go. When the weather's bad, we stop playing and have a rest.
Yeah, it really depends on weather.
Yeah, and when the weather's good, we go back out there and build things again.
Glad. And what kept me wonder is that, you've been in this field for 40 years. So the first day, you have ventured into this field in terms of education, right? How is the evolution took place in terms of education itself?
Like I said, I'm a little bit older, so I've had quite a few birthdays, but looking back to the early 80s when I was at school, it was very much the chalkboard scene and open books and writing with pens. In the education field, I guess there's still a bit of that writing to be done, but not in books, but on computers. And yeah, as the technologies have evolved and the innovation in the education field has meant for seafarers, it's a much different story now to what it was back in the early days when I was first being educated. I think as technology has moved on, it's changed the whole landscape of how people undertake their learning or how they gain knowledge. And whereas in my day back at school, it was very rote, somebody transmitted at the front of the class and you had to absorb it. I think the style now in the modern age is that you're a sponge from all different directions. And of course, computers have evolved so that we have the World Wide Web and the internet. But I think more importantly, with that connectivity it's given us through Wi-Fi. And again, that's another issue for seafarers because we don't always have good internet connectivity. But where we do, or when we're in port, it's opened up a whole new area of where we can carry on our education when we're at work. So back in the day, it used to be you had to attend classes, schools, or go to college, polytechnics or universities, and it was very much face-to-face. My story as I've evolved, because I had quite a humble upbringing, a mediocre sort of education, but later in life, I had a thirst for education and I took on 3 master's degrees. I did that self-funded and I could do it distance learning. By that time in my career, I was a practitioner, so I had the experience and all the background, but to get a formal education in it, you have to go back to the book work, or rather the laptop work. And yeah, I found that a lot more satisfying to do. Being later on in my career, I was much more motivated, not only because I paid for it, but those sort of advantages meant that I could do it whilst at work, on my rest time, or when the weather was bad and the ship wasn't working. So it gives the seafarer, the mariner, those sort of opportunities. And it doesn't have to be higher education. Of course, many of the seafarers are taking online training in radar, GMDSS, and some of the qualifications they need. Unlike in the offshore industry, where we have certain certifications for offshore survival, working at heights, all those sort of things. And I guess the pandemic has brought this on, but a lot of the education field and the training fields have definitely gone a lot more online now. So even some of those safety specific trainings can be done online in part. Of course, there's always a practical element, so you're obliged to go and do the practical elements, which is only right. But wherever the case is that it's book learning or knowledge that you have to absorb, or some of the tests, then that they can be done online. So it saves time. Sometimes it can save travel, a lot more efficient, cost effective.
Okay, that's very precisely answered. But I also catch the point where you were saying that, those days, because you're in this field for 40 years, right? So you've experienced the time where there was no internet and everything. How did you manage that era, where there was no internet and it was so hard for you to connect to your families? Was it a very tough time, and how did you manage?
Oh, well, let's put it this way. Coming from the United Kingdom, if I wanted to communicate with someone, I was a lot younger then, of course. We had to go to the bottom of the road to a red box, and in that red box was a telephone, and you had to hope that somebody owned a telephone in their house at the time, or not, as the case may be. Of course, now we all walk around with smart devices in our hand, and we have instant communication. So for the modern generation now, it's quite hard to understand and to think about how do we communicate, how do we get on without those things. And I know for some folks, especially my children, if their phone broke or they dropped it and it broke and they didn't have their phone for a day, it was like somebody had cut their arm off. It was just a tragedy and it was the end of the world. But what we have to reflect on, I think, is the importance or how we communicate. I see a lot of people now with their head down the whole time, even in restaurants or bars, staring at their phone, flicking through what to me mainly is quite a lot of garbage. But if it's entertainment and that's what they wish to do, instead of talking to their friends and colleagues and loved ones, and so be it. But yeah, so I think back then it was expectations were not that high. if you could communicate, and it was by posting or sending a letter, like in submarines where we're incognito, there is no communications, then you deal with life without any communications. I think that the modern world now, where we're instantly and always when we're awake, some of us half asleep in the morning sometimes, going online and communicating is I don't know, is different.
Yes,
don't get me
it
wrong.
Definitely is.
Don't get me wrong, it's an advantage. So now, whereas before I had very little communication, now I can every minute, if I so wished, talk to my loved ones and family. So, and being above water now means that when we do have connectivity, that's possible. So I don't miss out on so many of the things that I ordinarily would have, or that I did in the past. Of course, some of the voyages I did on ships in the past, I could be away for 2 or 3 months, and it was only when I returned could I find out what the news was or what had been happening in the family. So yeah, very hard for the modern people and the younger generation to actually comprehend all that. But yeah, so I think your expectations are a lot higher. So immediately you're looking for that Wi-Fi connection, or am I still connected? Do I have the connectivity? Whereas I think in truth, if you didn't have that, your life would still carry on, although it doesn't always seem that way.
So yeah, Mr. Gordon, you were saying that earlier you were talking about the technology have revolved when we were talking about in terms of how the connectivity, how you were keeping in touch with your family back then and now and everything. But also that I've mentioned earlier that I'm from the oil and gas background, so very much related to offshore. So I'm developing products, or I'm R&D based on offshore technologies product related, very much on that based. So I just want to know more of your experience and your thoughts on the innovation, especially in offshore and oil and gas industry as a whole, not only on offshore. It's also could be downstream and everything, right? It's a very big industry. So what are your thoughts and your experience, especially on the innovation and the technology revolution that actually took place in oil and gas industry as a whole?
I think if you look back originally from the sort of Aberdeen point of view in the United Kingdom, where a lot in the 50s and 60s, the technology and project experience that come from the Gulf of Mexico, that was where they were building up for the sort of North Sea, both in the Danish and Norwegian side as well. And a lot of that innovation had come from land initially, because of course this is where most of the drilling went on originally for the hydrocarbons. But we then looked further afield, and of course then that was the shallow water. But as we moved deeper, it brought in a lot of innovation in different technologies. So initially a lot of the work subsea was done with divers, and of course we then moved into robotics in the deeper waters and saturation diving, and then eventually where divers couldn't go, then we were innovating with robotics and diverless tasks and intervention subsea. So a great many leaps and bounds have been made in those sort of areas. So a lot of it has been around sort of the size and capability of vessels, because I'm maritime based and seafaring based, as opposed to the platforms or the assets themselves. So when you have a virgin field and you're looking at putting the infrastructure on and creating the first wellheads, all the infrastructure that then ties all that in, depending on where you've got your water injection and how many wells you've got, and all the pipelines, all the sea lines involved with that. And of course, with that becomes, your communications and power cables, and how you tie it all together on the seabed. So over a great many years, the vessels that conduct those tasks, whether they've been vertical lay, S-lay, J-lay type vessels, have become quite massive and technically advanced, and of course very expensive. So a lot of the fields, when they started out, obviously it costs millions and billions of dollars in some of the smaller fields. Now some of the larger fields that are in deep water offshore, and I've been on a project offshore Nigeria, which is in 1,500 meter plus of water. Then the whole time frame changes, what the developers wish the field and the size, from original seismic surveys, and the reservoir management itself becomes totally modernized in a whole new way of thinking about it to get the best from the life of the field, but also looking at the sustainability. And like they are now in the North Sea, talking about decommissioning. So that doesn't enter the realm of many people's viewpoint on oil and gas, but they are very, looking at the sustainability, very much looking at the environmental impacts. Very much so. There's a whole new business evolving around decommissioning. And of course, as you're aware, some of the vessels that were involved in arriving at a topside and then actually coming around that topside, disassembling all the infrastructure involved with it, and then lifting a complete topside of hundreds of tons of machinery off. And that's just the bit you can see above water. Of course, below water, there's another whole realm of working subsea to revert that area back in accordance with the environmental protocols that they have at the time there. So yeah, a great deal of innovation, firstly in how they went about it, how we move further offshore, and how they're now using FPSOs in very deep water projects to the actual complete life cycle of projects and the decommissioning phases, which again is a multi-billion dollar business and will take more than the remainder of my lifetime. So yeah, a whole new skill set, a whole new industry being built around the decommissioning side.
Okay, what are your thoughts on, so now that you mentioned on decommissioning side and FPSO and all that, that's fair enough. What about in terms of how are we actually trying to save the environment in oil and gas industry?
I think some of the topics, with climate change, or more so in the conversations around net zero carbon emissions, and that the framework that everyone's working to is an energy transition, and obviously that leads to renewables, and the size of the renewable projects and the scope and the amount of nations that are now involved in the renewables projects. For me as a mariner, it's not so much of a transition, because it's what we always do. It's basically civil engineering or critical infrastructure engineering, but at sea. So it's maritime construction. So really, whatever is being constructed, we're using very similar tools on sometimes the same vessels, even depending on what that task is. So whereas we'd be looking at suction piles or foundations for what were oil rig platforms, those very same vessels and technologies are now being used for the foundations for offshore wind turbines, for example. Of course, a byproduct of a lot of the experience and technology and the engineering skills that originated in oil and gas in the marine environment are also being used for wave technology and other forms of renewables. So wind isn't the only one, but it's the major one, and it's what everyone's talking about now, and it seems to be the most efficient and effective. So a great deal of projects are set up with that. And what we have to remember is that Dong originally, as an oil field developer and owned assets in the North Sea, have transitioned as a company themselves completely away from hydrocarbons and are now known as Ørsted, and one of the biggest players now globally in the renewable energy, specifically the offshore wind market. So as we work towards that, there are a great many skill sets that are easily transitioned. For instance, seismic surveys, geophysical surveys. We have a lot more to do with unexploded ordnance. So I've also worked with UXO and bomb disposal around certain areas where we wish to do this, build this infrastructure. So some of those skill sets are easily transferable. Maybe even some of the geology ones, of course, because these fields will also do geotechnical engineering and site investigations, much the same as oil companies would have done prior to thinking about what assets they're going to be able to put in a field. Yeah, so the skill set's there, the transition is pretty easy for most disciplines, and the vessels are there, and of course innovation comes into it again, and we've seen some of the offshore wind turbines that were, should we say, relatively small and only the sort of height of a house, whereas now they're far exceeding the Eiffel Tower in size and up to 15 megawatts. So innovation comes again with cranes, heavy lifts, and the vessels that need to be capable and future-proof, from a corporate sort of idea of the knowledge of how these wind turbines are increasing in size, and having the facilities, the capacity, and having the maritime assets and the crane heights to be actually to be able to install these. And of course, within my generation, we will be decommissioning those. So whereas oil and gas, you know, a lot of the pipelines that I've installed over the years had 100-year life expectancy, that for very good reasons, the hydrocarbons that they're carrying, but also it wasn't envisaged that they would be changing these out or renewing them over the life cycle. So they had to be robust enough and in that sort of environment to last for those durations. But of course, with the wind industry changing and the innovation in the size of these turbines means that some developers will eventually wish to remove, maybe after 20 or 30 years, some of the smaller turbines and use the development site that they've got to reinstall much larger ones. And the idea of the larger ones, of course, is that they have a bigger footprint when you're thinking about height or aircraft flying over. But yeah, they can produce a lot more energy per unit, and therefore we don't need so many of them. So somebody that had a smaller site with smaller turbines on can still use that smaller site, but create a lot more energy by reinstalling these larger turbines. And of course, some of these turbines in the North Sea around the United Kingdom that are around the 20-year-old now. So although we like to think that the oil and gas is a lot more matured as an industry itself, in my time in the industry offshore, of course, now people are talking about some of these offshore wind farms are very mature now. So yeah. So for some nations, it will be a new technology with the offshore wind renewables. For others, they will be thinking shortly about decommissioning or replacement of some of these. So yeah, very exciting field to be in. And if you're an engineer, of course, the innovations are just endless. So whether it's a monopile in the shallow waters, or the TPs or the transition pieces, how they're modernizing those, we now have access and safety related equipment, which means that we've got walk to work, which is basically a crane gangway that the ship can go on dynamic positioning and then put a walkway across so that the engineers and technicians can move across in a safe manner. And like I've mentioned before, the cranes and the heavy lift technology is becoming something quite special now with these larger units. And of course, they're being built all around the world. So we do have typhoons and hurricanes, and although people think the North Sea is quite a rough and ready place to work and challenging from an environment, from an engineering point of view, yeah, working in Asia now as I do, it's a similar thing. We're always fighting with the Mother Nature and the environment.
Always. Like I remembered that you mentioned on this wave energy as well. So how is demand of the wave energy at the moment? Because the last time when I was doing my research and everything, at the moment, I think one of our product also, we were doing a hybrid system, solar and wind turbine. So we combine that together. So that's also one of the trend at the moment. But in terms of wave energy and everything, I think if I'm not wrong, it's more of on the expensive side. It's still on the higher range compared to solar and wind turbine. So do you think wave is in trend, or it's something that there's a long way to go for it?
I've only dealt myself with site investigation areas in coastal areas where they were considering doing wave energy. But of course, coming from the United Kingdom, where especially on the west coast, and that we're one of the biggest tidal ranges as well, that tidal energy was a really big thing. But the trouble, I think, with that is that the impact from an environmental aspect has been one that's prevented, especially around the Bristol Channel area, with migratory birds, marshlands, and the wetlands that are there. That it doesn't lead itself to being cost effective. So when you think of the lots of money that are involved, and from the developer's point of view, of course, they're going to look for the easy targets and the less expensive technologies that are around. But of course, we all thought in my lifetime that electric cars and electric vehicles would never be part of the future. Whereas now in the UK, I think they've even stated that they're going to stop importing or building any cars that are petrol or diesel driven, and at some point it'll come to the point where we will all have electric cars, and it won't be won't be such a giggle anymore. The future that we thought was far off on the horizon is actually very rapidly closing in on us.
Looks like it.
So some of those technologies are there, and we have experimental hubs. There's one in Scotland. I think there's one around the Irish Sea. There's one in the West Country of the UK where I live, where a lot of innovative companies are looking at before they scale up some of these technologies. And there have been obviously some wave and some tidal systems that have proven well. And I think it's just going to come down to where those technologies can be applied better and efficiently. And as technology moves on, the cost becomes lower. And it's much the same as wind. Some of these turbines, obviously, they started out quite small. But when the technology and they knew that the investment was there, everyone started building them more efficiently, larger and even more efficiently, to the point where everyone's clamoring to get the next best thing. And it's the same with electric cars and that on land. You know, some of the high-end marques like BMW have brought out ones that are, you know, very funky. People do like them. They don't look like electric cars, to the point where they've even had to put engine noises on them so they don't just hum like a spaceship. Yeah, and people are buying them, and they'll be selling a lot more. So I think, or I would hope that the renewables energies mix becomes a lot more of a mix, and some of the wave and tidal energy does come into the frame. And of course, some coastal areas and some nations will have that as a preference, maybe even. And those technologies that are subsea, like tidal, is very good, where you don't want to see infrastructure on the horizon. So if you're at the beach or in a coastal area, you don't necessarily want to look out at great big engineering and metal objects. You want to see a horizon or the seascape that naturally it should be.
Okay, that's a pretty detail on renewables itself, right? So now that we know that oil and gas industry have pledged for this environmental net zero carbon emission by the year of 2050, this is a very hype topic on environmental, especially in oil and gas industry. And also in Malaysia, our giant operator would be Petronas. They also have pledged this net zero carbon emission by 2050. So we, on the other side, as a researcher and everything, we always focus on developing any technologies or any products that which able to curb this problem. So that's like one of my products I'm working on at the moment. Also, it's actually very much related to coming out with solution or overcoming this carbon problem. So what is your thought on this carbon emissions, on CCUS, this entire technology itself, carbon capture, storage?
I think it's admirable that everyone started talking about it. I think it's also good for our future generations and my grandchildren that this conversation is happening. But I'm more pleased that although people have set targets, nations have set targets, and 2050 is a big one, there have been targets for 2030, 2040 as well, in various different disciplines and fields.
Correct.
And they cover the whole gambit.
Correct.
The hydrocarbons being one. But of course, like we've touched on earlier, fuels, different fuel sources. What are the future ships going to be? Everyone's thinking about autonomous, but of course, how are we going to fuel them as well? So there's been discussions, about obviously losing the heavy marine oils and going towards hydrogen or ammonia or hybrid products. So I think on the one hand, it's good that we've had those conversations earlier. For my mind, they could have been even earlier. But I think that the modern world now and the innovations and the way that we're looking at it is that it's not just talking, and that there's going to be action. And I think that's the important thing. So for all the COP26 and everything else that's going about climate, it's great to talk about it, but at the end of the day, you need the actions and you need the results. So as we've seen on land with electric cars, although they're not in everyone's price pocket, or there's EV charging stations that need to go everywhere, it'll happen. But it's good that we're not still just talking about it. We can actually see electric cars on the road now, and we can see EV charging stations. So in the maritime world, with Maersk, that are heavily invested now in the next evolution of shipping and of hybrid fuel sources, it's happening in the renewables energy. There are nations that never even considered building ships themselves, or specialist technology ships for building the infrastructure of offshore wind farms. But where I work now in Taiwan, the nation have got themselves together and they've laid the first keel, and they will, as a nation themselves, actually be sufficient then in starting off. So rather than talk about it, they're actually doing it now, and they will have those ships with the technology to be able to do it. So I think all nations have done the talking, so it's time for action now. And I'm just thankful that and the career that I've had has meant that I've easily transitioned, and I'm now part of that process, and the ships that I work on, and the teams and the crews, and everyone's happy to be working in the field of offshore renewables. But of course, renewables just isn't one thing. Mankind, as part of that process, has not been too kind to the environment. So one of the good projects that I've been involved in is the ocean cleanup, which is Borne and the Dutch company. So when you think about projects that go offshore, one of the more interesting ones is large scale and NGO type environmental projects. So the ocean cleanup is one where we've gone to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and removing plastics. And of course, it's one of my pet hates that mankind, whenever they're building anything or come up with some innovative or revolutionary idea like polymers and plastics, that yes, they do transform our lives, both obviously on land, because pretty much everything that's around you, Visha, and everything that's around me at the moment has got some plastics or polymer in it, and it has truly revolutionized our lives and our surroundings. But a lot of the byproducts of that are ending up in the oceans where they should never be. So this project, the ocean cleanup, is actually cleaning up the mess that mankind has made. And I think that's another great thing about the offshore world and seafarers, that, you know, when they put their mind to it, they can achieve pretty much anything. And if one of the, you know, which was lower down the pecking order about talking about climate or what we're doing to the environment and sustainability, I think one of the major things is to get the plastics out of the ocean. So somebody like that that's taken that on board. And pre-pandemic, I went to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and was involved in the R&D and the innovations that we're making on the plastic capture technology. And if you follow them, yeah, they've got YouTube, and you can follow them online now, where they've got proof now that they can do it at large scale, and they will upscale that. So originally it was a small, yeah, well, originally they actually went quite big and made a good effort at originally trying to capture the plastic, but then they scaled back down a bit to ensure that it was scalable and usable, and they had proof of technology only just recently. So the future looks good for that, and the more plastic we can take out of the oceans, the better.
Well, that's really good. So when did actually they came out? Like, when was this idea was established? Is it like ongoing at this point of time, this plastic capture technology?
Yes, it was. I think if you Google it and you go behind the scenes, Boy was a sort of entrepreneur that took himself out of university. I think he was doing an aeronautical degree at the time, but he was based it all around plastics, because he was somebody that loved the seas, the oceans, liked swimming and scuba diving like me, but didn't like coming across all the plastic. And as on Netflix, there's been quite a few related to the damage that it does to the marine life, the ecosystem, and obviously seabirds as well. So he put his mind to starting a project to actually find out how much plastic there might be in the gears. And the Great Pacific Garbage Patch was named, I think, at least 10 years ago. So people that transited through that area knew that it was a gear which in the way that the oceans move meant that it was quite a bit of a spiral. So this was an area that was naturally capturing quite a lot of plastics. And I think there's 5 gears in different oceans and seas, and they're all doing much the same thing. So of course it's land-based. Humans create it. It goes out through the rivers. It ends up in the seas and oceans. And in some of these collection points, it's quite significant, to say the least. Wow. So he crowdfunded and got an aeroplane to fly over it and tried different formats of mapping these areas and where they might be. And off the back of that, they got global interest to the point where they've got 2 vessels now sponsored kindly through Maersk Supply Services, and they're out there trying these different technologies, and they're at a point now where hopefully they will upscale and move into the other gears. They're also doing quite a good effort in the rivers as well. So some of the most polluted rivers have got one of their machines in that's basically like an agricultural unit that's not affecting the fish or the sea life in there, but is cleaning off the plastic before it leaves the rivers and enters the oceans.
Wow.
So yeah, it's something for the future as well, because the maritime, for most people living on land, is, of course, they see the horizon, but for the most part we're over the horizon and out of view. But that's much the same as plastics and some of the debris that humans end up putting in the oceans. That just because it's out of view and people don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. It's there, and it's in considerable volumes. So it's good that people have looked over the horizon, seen the mess that mankind has made, and there's some really nice people trying to put a dent in that and make good.
But this is such a great effort. Like, seriously, it's like another level of revolution on this entire environment in offshore, because they've been always talking about this, but this is the one that, like what you mentioned earlier, put things into action. For environment purpose, it's always that we pledge this and that, and we've been talking this for the longest time. And now that I see that they've put things into action, and it's very great future, I would really say that. Like what you have shared earlier, right, Mr. Gordon, from in terms of the in terms of your education itself, and then the innovation in oil and gas, and then your renewables, and you get a great examples on the electric car especially, and then on the environmental impact on oil and gas, and also the innovations that's taken place in order to overcome all these problems. They're really amazing, and I'm actually quite impressed with this plastic capture technology, and also the ocean cleaning, right? You were saying the ocean
cleanup.
The ocean cleanup.
So everyone out there, you'll have to Google it. The ocean cleanup, and it's Boyan Slat. There's a Dutch guy who started up this charitable company, and
Wow.
yeah, they're putting a big dent in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and removing the plastics.
That
But I
is
think,
like,
yeah, it's all about education, because if people don't know about it, it never would have been done. But there were
true.
some people with a lot of vision and forethought and knew that it was there, and rather than talk about it, decided to take action. And basically from crowdfunding, has accumulated enough money to go out there, and then the fundraising and the backers for it. It's fantastic.
Honestly, it's a
And
very
of course, it all helps our future. And I think part of that is going back to the beginning again about education. So if we can educate people that single-use plastics are no good, and even if it's single-use plastic and you have to use it, then recycle, dispose of it through a recycling so it becomes a closed loop. It will take generations for the amount of plastics that we've already created. But yeah, there is a way and a mean, and it just means that people have got to take action and not talk about it. So when we go back to education, it is definitely education that will lead to all this. And one of my pet projects is working in the schools outreach program called Inspiring the Future. So well, linked with innovation and technology, it's a way that myself, as a maritime ambassador for Maritime UK, even when I'm in Taiwan on my ship, I can virtually enter school classrooms and talk to the children in the schools. Sometimes it's a single school, but I've also been invited to shows where they link up 20 schools. So 20 schools, each with about 3 or 4 classrooms with their teachers, can all link in together. And then we discuss about maritime careers. But the thing that I like to get across is the basics about breaking down stereotypes, about diversity, about women, STEM subjects, encouraging the young ladies to take on maritime careers and showing them that there is a future and giving them hope. And of course, some of the children come from, should we say, challenging backgrounds, and it's broadening horizons and making them see beyond their own village or town that there's a big wide world out there. And by encouraging them to think a little bit outside the box and outside their village and town, that there is a global community where a lot of nations are coming together to achieve these things. So why shouldn't they be involved?
Thank you so much for your sharing today, because to be honest, it's for me to hear from a very different perspective, because I'm, even though from an oil and gas industry, but always I will look on the process side, on innovation on the process side, automation on the process side. It's very, I'm narrowed down to that one particular scope. But from your side, it's there's a lot more for us to learn, like what you have mentioned earlier. I think it's a very different perspective of you looking on in terms of innovation, especially in oil and gas industry, from what we are actually looking at. So this is a very good context, and I think it's a very
But,
great sharing.
but they're also complementary, because with your chemical background and knowing what the hydrocarbons are, it's a fantastic thing. It isn't the devil or the evil. It is just a natural product mineral that we've had. So these hydrocarbons, and of course we're all built from carbon anyway, has made the modern world, and still is. So there was always a place for hydrocarbons, because the innovation that comes from the breakdown of those hydrocarbons and how they're made into the different polymers and products that we use every day in our lives means that those can be put to good use, like all the components that are in a ship, or like the ocean cleanup when they're using their meshes to actually capture this plastic. All those are hydrocarbon based
Correct,
products.
fair enough.
So when we do scrape all the plastic out, we can recycle all that again. So as long as it remains within a cycle and remains where it should be for its intended use, and not out there in the environment doing harm, then yeah, education is a part of that.
Yes,
But so are hydrocarbons as well.
exactly. So whatever that we spoke today, everything, it all comes back to education, right? It all is like, how are we like looking at, I think it's the experience, it's one, but it's also the education. I think without education, exposure, and all these sort of things come into one together, I don't think so we are able to come with this innovation solution in oil and gas industry, in renewable, and especially in environment aspect. And you also mentioned on safety as well, right?
Always, because I work in a high risk environment like yourself. So, and I was previously a submariner. So when you think about those challenging environments and high risk environments, then you have to be safety orientated, and primarily that's what my role is on the ship, ensuring that whatever project we're executing is done ultimately in the most safest way. So efficiency is one thing, but primarily doing it safely, and that's not only for our people, but also the assets, or what I've led to today, and that's the environment, most definitely.
Great.
But yeah, education, you said, it is the start and the be all and end all, really, because if we don't have that education that then allows us to have that knowledge and overarching experience, and then a bigger, wider view, mankind would stagnate, and we won't move forward in rectifying some of the damage we've done, but also looking at innovative and new ways of going about our business. And whether it's the cars turning into electric, or aircraft that are using lean burn fuels and are quieter, or in my maritime world, thinking of alternative fuels and hybrid vessels, and eventually autonomous. But yeah, the only way is education. And of course, the future is the children. So that's what we should be teaching now. And I think a lot of them are growing up in schools now, understanding more about what the climate is, how STEM and those subjects, and especially when women are involved, to actually put themselves forward for these challenging roles and technologies.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gordon, for concluding it so well. And then, like how you have mentioned, education and women in STEM, all these efforts, it's really very important. I think they are the future, and I think it's not only women in STEM, of course, anyone, but it's the base of education, like what you mentioned, and you have highlighted all this. I think it's a very great insight. In fact, I learned a lot. I'm actually stunned. I'm not able to ask a lot of questions because you were sharing a lot of things. I was like, wow, wow. I was just amazed.
That's the whole idea of fantastic programs like you're running now. So when people watch the recording, they can say, oh yeah, I come from this nation, and I was in this discipline, this trade, and I was doing this. But really what Gordon said is it's just opened up a whole new thing, and it'll make people look at a different avenue or a different way of looking at things, or looking a little bit more on the wider world. And of course, as we've touched on, diversity and equity is everything, because we are stronger, together.
Perfect.
So strength in diversity.
I think you covered all the topics. I just don't have to ask any more questions because we're just going one after one and after one. It was perfect. It was
Well,
really
I've given you a whirlwind tour. Welcome to the Maritime.
Yeah, all rounder, right? Anyway, thank you so much, and have a safe trip back to UK. You're flying off
Thank you very
next
much,
week,
Lisa.
right? Yeah,
Thank you
okay.
for having me here.
Okay, thank you so much.